Imagine living in a time when the faith of the people was constantly tested by external influences. This is exactly what happened in Israel when Jezebel, daughter of the king of Sidon, married Ahab, king of Israel. This union was not only political, but also religious, because it brought with it the worship of Baal, a false god venerated by the Phoenicians. Jezebel did not arrive in Israel as a simple queen. She came with a purpose to replace worship to the Lord with pagan idolatry. And as we will see, this decision had devastating consequences. Before we start, I want to invite you to reflect on an important question. Are you ready to learn from Jezebel's story and apply these powerful lessons in your life? If you feel that this content can transform your spiritual walk, subscribe now to the channel, activate notifications, and prepare for a deeper and more challenging journey of faith. Let us exploit the lessons that God has left us through the story and how we can live more faithfully, fair and resistant to the temptations of the world. Now, let's understand what really happened to Jezebel and how its story applies to this day. With Jezebel in power, idolatry took over Israel. Altars were erected for Baal. Priests were assigned to worship him, and the people were gradually seduced to abandon faith in the true God. This not only affected the spirituality of the nation, but also its morality and justice. When a society moves away from God, the inevitable result is corruption, injustice, and abuse of power. Jezebel embodied this reality, for his government was marked by manipulation and intolerance with those who dared to oppose his dominion. The impact of this idolatry was not limited to Israel. Judah also began to suffer negative influences. After all, when leaders surrender to evil, their actions resonate for generations. The reign of Jezebel and Achabe created an environment where the true prophets of God were persecuted and silenced, while false prophets increasingly gained power. This scenario is a warning for any time when faith is exchanged for personal interest. The consequences can be catastrophic. Given this context, an essential question arises: how far could Jezebel's influence go before God intervened? The answer to this question would not take a long time to appear. Elijah, the prophet of the Lord, was raised to confront the situation and announce the divine judgment. But Jezebel was not willing to retreat so easily. The clash between idolatry and true faith was about to intensify, and upcoming events would show that no one challenges God in impunity. Jezebel not only brought idolatry to Israel, she made a point of eliminating any opposition. His first great action was to pursue the prophets of the Lord, trying to eradicate any trace of true faith. While Ahab seemed to be a weak and influential king, Jezebel was decided and relentless. Many prophets were killed, and those who survived had to hide. If it were not for Obadiah, a faithful servant of God who protected 100 prophets in caves, the devastation would have been even greater. Jezebel wanted only the voice of the false prophets of Baal, and he will be heard, but God had other plans. Jezebel's influence on Ahab was not limited to religion. It also manipulated the king's political decisions. One of the most striking episodes of this domination was Naboth's murder. Ahab wanted the vineyard of this righteous man, but Naboth refused to sell it, for she was part of the heritage of her ancestors. The king, childishly frustrated, regretted the palace, and Jezebel, without hesitation, elaborated a plan to take the vineyard forcibly. Using false accusations and corrupt witnesses, Naboth was unfairly sentenced to death. With this, Jezebel showed that there were no limits to his cruelty. But God does not ignore injustice. Elijah, the prophet, was sent to confront Phoenish and announce the divine judgment. He stated that just as Naboth was killed, Ahab's family would also face destruction. What's more, Jezebel would have a tragic end. The body would not be buried with honor, but devoured by dogs. This prophecy was a clear warning that God would not allow evil to reign forever. But Jezebel, proud and arrogant, didn't pay attention. She believed that her power made her untouchable. Jezebel's story teaches us an essential truth: abuse of power and manipulation may seem effective in the short term, but never go unpunished. Injustice may even prosper for a while, but God always has the last word. The trial was already decreed, and Jezebel could not escape the fate that awaited her. The big question was how and when would this prophecy be fulfilled? This moment was coming and would be more impactful than anyone could imagine. The time of divine patience has come to an end, and God raised an instrument to execute his judgment on the house of Ahab, a fearless military commander. When the prophet Elisha sent one of his disciples to anoint Jehu as king of Israel, the mission came with a clear order: he should exterminate the lineage of Ahab and end the influence of Jezebel. This call was not only political, but spiritual. Israel needed to be purified from idolatry and injustice that dominated the nation. The moment of confrontation was near, and Jehu would not hesitate to act. The first to fall was Jehu, son of Jezebel and successor of Ahab. While fleeing from Jehu, he was struck deadly by a certain arrow. His death was not a simple war accident, but a fulfillment of God's word. He represented the continuity of his mother's corrupt legacy, and his fall marked the beginning of the end of Jezebel's house. Divine justice, which seemed to be delayed, now advanced without resistance. And Jezebel, the true responsible for Israel's spiritual decay, would be next to face his destiny. When Jehu arrived at Jezebel's palace, she tried to use her last weapon, manipulation. With arrogance, he arranged, painted his eyes, and appeared in the window, as if he could still exercise control over the situation. But Jehu was not fooled. He ordered his servants to throw her out the window. Jezebel fell and died brutally, and his blood scored on the walls and horses. Once again, Elijah's prophecy was fulfilled with scary accuracy. But divine justice was not yet complete. When they went to get the body to bury it, they found only the skull, feet, and hands. Dogs had devoured the rest, just as God had announced. Jezebel, who saw himself as indestructible, ended without grave, without honor, and without legacy. Its end was a relentless reminder that no one can challenge God and go unpunished. However, his story did not disappear. It has become a symbol of the danger of idolatry and spiritual corruption, and this symbolism would echo far beyond its time. Jezebel's influence did not end with his death. Centuries later, his name reappears in the book of Apocalypse, where Jesus warns the church of Thyatira over a woman who claimed to be a prophetess, but brought the people to idolatry and immorality. Revelation 2:20. This reference does not mean that Jezebel herself is risen, but that her spirit standard of deception, manipulation, and corruption, she was able to act. This parallel warns us about the danger of spiritual leaders who divert people from truth, promoting distorted teachings to satisfy their own interests. Another powerful symbol linked to Jezebel is the Great Babylon, described in Revelation 17:56 as the mother of the prostitution and abominations of the earth. Just as Jezebel seduced Israel to idolatry, Babylon represents a system of spiritual and moral corruption that tries to dispel human from God. The connection is clear. Both cases show how abuse of power and seduction can lead to the collapse of whole nations. However, the end of the system is already decreed. As far as Jezebel fell, the Great Babylon will also be destroyed in the final judgment. This repetition of Jezebel's pattern throughout the Bible teaches us a valuable lesson. As long as there is greed, manipulation, and idolatry, its influence will continue to emerge in different forms. We can see echoes of this in corrupt governments, in religious leaders who exploit the faith of others, and even in situations of our daily lives, where power is used for their own benefit at the expense of others. But just as God intervened against Jezebel in the past, he will also judge all injustice at the right time. The story of Jezebel, then, is not just a report of the past, but a living warning for all time. The abuse of authority, the unbridled pursuit of power, and the deviation of faith always have consequences. But contrary to what Jezebel thought, God is in control, and no one can escape his judgment. This leads us to an important reflection. What can we learn from all this, and how to avoid falling into the same traps? Jezebel's story offers us deep lessons about the consequences of idolatry, injustice, and abuse of authority. Jezebel, in worshiping Baal and leading Israel on this path, brought an era of spiritual and moral decay to God's people. What she did was more than simply exchanging one God for another. She pushed the people from Israel out of true faith and justice, who should rule their lives. Idolatry, although disguised as benevolent religious practices, always leads to destruction, as it diverts the focus of the human being to something or someone who is not confident. Moreover, the way Jezebel uses power to persecute the prophets of the Lord and manipulate in his reign teaches us about the dangers of an insensitive heart to justice. When power is used to oppress and manipulate, it leaves a trail of pain, suffering, and death. The lesson we can take from this is that Regardless of our social position or authority, we are called to act justice and treat others with respect and dignity. Otherwise, the results will be disastrous, as we saw in the tragedy of Jezebel's death. Another important aspect we can learn from this story is resilience and faith. Although God's prophets were persecuted and many were killed, the truth always prevails. The resistance to Jezebel was not in vain, and divine judgment has come to correct the iniquities. In our own lives, we often face difficulties and oppositions, but we must remember that God never fails to fulfill his promises. Resilience is fundamental, for in the end God is sovereign and his righteousness will be done. Finally, Jezebel's story also reminds us that no one can escape divine judgment. Jezebel's arrogance and pride blinded her into reality that God does not tolerate evil forever. When injustice seems to triumph and evil seems invincible, we must trust that the Lord is in control and that judgment will come in his time. This gives us hope because it reminds us that despite the temporary circumstances, God will always do justice. Jezebel's story is not just an old account, she continues to speak to our hearts to this day. What can we learn from the life of this powerful but tragically bankrupt woman? The greatest lesson may be that no one, no matter how much you try to manipulate others or deceive, can challenge God's authority and escape unpunished. Idolatry, corruption, and abuse of power are spiritual diseases that destroy not only individuals but an entire nation. The example of Jezebel calls us to reflection on the direction our choices can take. Will we be faithful to God, or will we be seduced by the false promises of power and manipulation? Therefore, it is important that by looking at Jezebel's life, we can take a sincere examination of our own spiritual walk. Are we allowing idolatry, injustice, or corruption to take over our attitudes? Are we being instruments of manipulation, or are we living with integrity, seeking the true righteousness of God? Jezebel's story challenges us to reflect on these issues and to turn us to the Lord in repentance, always seeking to live according to their principles. In reflecting on the story of Jezebel, we are challenged to examine our own spiritual walk. Are we following God's ways with integrity, or are we allowing the temptations of idolatry, abuse of power, and manipulation to influence our choices? Jezebel's trajectory reminds us that even if evil seems to triumph for a while, divine justice will always prevail. No lie, no abuse, no corruption is unanswered in God's judgment. The question is, how are we positioning ourselves about this? Are we willing to resist what is wrong and keep firm in faith, or will we be seduced by the false promises of the world? Now is the time to act. How can you apply this lesson to your life? In what areas do you need to change to live more aligned with God's will? Reflect, make a decision, and allow your faith to be strengthened every day. May the resilience of a faithful heart to the Lord become the mark of your life. If this content has touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and enable notifications. Do not lose the next messages that can further transform your spiritual journey. May God continue to bless your walk.